Welcome back. In the previous chapter, we showed you how to download packages into RStudio on local computers, and we showed you how to load texts into your RStudio using the Gutenberg R package and taking texts from Project Gutenberg. In this video, we will show you the first 3 steps to starting some basic exploratory textual analysis. These first 3 steps are loading your libraries, locating and reading your text into a variable, and inspecting and cleaning the text. Let's get started. In the previous videos, we showed you how to download packages into your RStudio. Since I am working on a local computer and not from Jupyter Notebook or some other cloud, I need to reload my packages into my system. To do this, I will be loading the Gutenberg R, TidyText, and Tidyverse libraries. We will put that code here and run all of it. Because I installed these libraries in the last video, I do not need to install the library again. I simply need to call it so that my computer knows to use these libraries in the code I am going to write after this. The next thing I want to do is load some data into my global environment. I will be loading the stop words data, which we will discuss more in a little bit. To do this, I will type data, parentheses and quotation marks, and then in those quotation marks, stop_words. When I run this code, I now have the stop words in my global environment. We will be using this later in cleaning our text. Now, step 1 of our process is complete. The next step is to locate and read our data. In the last video, we showed you how to find a specific novel or text or play of any sort from Project Gutenberg. We will be using that same code again today. First, we will want to view the metadata from Project Gutenberg. And once we have done that, we want to use our pipe operator to filter that data for a specific title. Remember, you want that title to have a double equal sign to tell your code that you are looking for specifically the words following. In this example, we are going to be using Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Project Gutenberg stores Frankenstein under its full title, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, so remember to type the entire title into this line of code. You will need to make sure that you have the full title for any other novels or plays that you may be using when you run this code later. Doing this shows us that there are 4 different kinds of Frankenstein that we could choose from. You will want to inspect these to determine which novel you want to use. First, let's look at the languages. They are all in English, which is the language I am looking for, so that does not help us narrow it down. Going further, let's look at which ones have text. You will notice that the second option does not have text, which means it's an audiobook. So we know we do not want to use row number 2's option because it will not provide us any text to work with. For today's purposes, we will be loading this first option, Gutenberg ID 84. To do this, let's go back to our code and load this. We're going to load it into a variable. So we're going to create a variable named Frankenstein, and then we're going to assign it to a download from Gutenberg and the number 84 because that's the novel we chose. Run this line of code, and after a minute, we will now have Frankenstein loaded in our environment. Step number 2 is now complete. Moving on to step number 3, we need to inspect and clean our data. This is probably one of the more lengthy things you will have to do when working with texts like these. Texts from Project Gutenberg usually contain words at the beginning and end of the novel that are of no use to us. Prefaces, notes from the author, notes from the people who published these on Project Gutenberg, etc. We are going to want to remove this before we start our analysis. First, let's start by inspecting our novel. The first function we are going to use is the structure function. So we will just look at the structure of Frankenstein, and it will show us a little bit of information about it. We will see that it is a tibble, or if you recall from the last video, a tiny table. And this tells us that it has 7,244 observations and 2 variables. This means that there are 7,000 rows and 2 columns. If we look down here, we can see what those 2 columns are. We will see that the first column is our Gutenberg ID, which will remain the same throughout the entire novel. The second is the actual text, and we will see that it is a character, whereas this is an integer, and we can see that the text has started in this column. Now let's try the head function. This will show us the first 6 lines of the data frame. So if we want to look at the head of Frankenstein, it shows us essentially the same thing, but in the way that it would look in the data frame, with our 2 columns and multiple rows. We can also use the tail function to see the end of the novel. You will see here that there is much more text. But what happens if we want to look for something in the middle of our text? There are a few different ways we can do this. First, let's type out the name of our variable, and then we're going to add this $sign, which is essentially telling the code that we want to look at a specific column. So we want to look at the text column because the other column does not really matter to us. And then in square brackets, we are going to say what row we want to look at. Let's pick row 68 and see what's happening there. We can see down here, this is just a line of text. Now let's try looking at multiple lines of text. We can do the same thing by specifying which column we want to look at, and in our square brackets, we're going to say we want to look at rows 195 through rows 201. Now, a larger chunk of text has appeared. So now we know that our data is indeed the text we are looking for. The next thing we need to do is clean this text. To clean the text, you're going to want to view it in its entirety using either the view function or by clicking Frankenstein up above. Looking at this, we can see that these first rows do not really have data that is interesting to us. The real text starts down here with perhaps to Mrs. Saville, or even where the letter actually begins here on line 20. All of the lines previous to this, we're going to want to get rid of. If we scroll all the way down to the bottom of this data frame, you will see that the text ends on the last line. Sometimes there is additional text afterward that does not actually have to do with the novel. And so if that was the case, you would need to cut that off as well. But this novel is nice because it ends with the last line. Keep in mind that this line is 7,244, and the line that our text starts on, we will say is line 16. Going back to our code, we're going to create a new variable. We are going to say that Frankenstein new is going to be assigned Frankenstein, but we are going to cut parts of it out. We are going to say that this new variable will start at line 16 and end at line 7,244. The other thing we need to add is a comma and a space. The reason for this is because we can index in both columns and rows. So when you do that, rows will always come first, then a comma, and then the columns. Now, we want to make sure that we have both columns and only some of the rows. So to do this, we will specify our row numbers, put our comma, and then we are going to leave a blank space indicating that we want all of the columns. If you had multiple columns, say 7 or 8, and you only wanted to look at 4 of them, you would add that specification in this space. You can see that if I run this code without that space and the comma, it will get mad at me because it thinks that I am looking for specifically columns. So anytime you are indexing by row, you need to have this comma and space. Running that line of code, we now see a second variable. This is our new Frankenstein. So again, using the view function or clicking this button, let's look at it. Now we see our data frame starts with the start of the letter. And again, it ends at the end of the novel. Perfect, we have now cut off all the excess material from our book. Now we have successfully finished the first 3 steps of textual analysis. In the next video, we are going to show you how to tokenize the novel, clean the novel again using the stop words data that we loaded previously, and then start the analysis.